He joined the Army later in the war. He was younger when the war started. He lied about his age to get in, and he was trained as a surgical tech. He was in the operating room and was stationed at a POW hospital in, I think, New Jersey. And he said he had good rapport with the German POWs. He spoke German, and they kind of took him under his wing. You know, he was just a kid, and they were typically older, and they talked to him about their experiences and all, and he decided he wanted to get into the war, so he was going to request a transfer, and the German POWs tried to talk him out of it. You know, they said there's not any glory or glamour to it. But he did transfer into a combat unit, and you know, you saw the information. His division was sent. You know, they went into combat right after the Battle of the Bulge. They weren't in combat a lot, like as much as some of the others, but they had more than their share of it. I mean, you know, any of that would be bad. One thing that he always stressed was how cold it was. They had plenty of food, but they didn't have a lot of warm clothing. So he and some buddies stole some blankets from the supply tent one night, and they cut them up and sewed them into their field jackets. There's several stories he told me. He said one in particular, probably about 3 weeks before the war ended, they were awakened and they were told that the war was over. And his I don't know, I think it was his company, his platoon, was given the instructions to go behind what had been German lines and destroy German weapons. So they get up before dawn and they take off, and they go through the German lines, and he said he saw people, German soldiers, you know, shaving, and they looked at him like, what's going on? You know, they just passed them by. There was no shots fired or anything. So they find some German weapons, and they're busy destroying them, and Dad said apparently the Germans had called ahead, you know, after they passed through the lines, and they were ambushed. They blew up the German tank, blew up the first 2 Jeeps, and I think he said the last Jeep, and they were captured. The Jeeps were what the Americans were in. The tanks were the German ambush. And he said they also had a German half-track that had a quad 20 millimeter cannon in it that they used, you know, to in the ambush. And there were quite a few wounded, and said the Germans shot the most seriously wounded people. And then they were captured, and they were, as they were gathered together on the road, there was a field, or I think he said a cornfield, but that wouldn't make sense. But anyway, there was a field there with some brush. German paratroopers came out, and one of them came up to Dad and gave him a handful of cigarettes and says, "For you, the war is over." And about that time, apparently the American commander learned what had happened and got in touch with the German commander, and they arranged a prisoner transfer. And the American commander told them that if any more Americans were, told the Germans that if any more Americans were shot, then he was going to completely level the town that was nearest. And he says from about that time on, there was always an American fighter circling overhead, protecting them. And they didn't, Dad didn't volunteer that he could speak German. And the people who had captured him were SS. And he said this SS lieutenant wanted to shoot them all. The German soldiers refused. And Dad told me after the war they found out who this German lieutenant was, and he was killed. But anyway, when they came back to the American lines in the prisoner exchange, he said as far as you could see in every direction, there were half tracks filled with men and tanks waiting. And as soon as they crossed over, they moved ahead in the German lines. He said another story that he told fairly frequently. They had taken this town. I think he said it was in Bavaria. I'm not sure just where it was. And after they had taken it, then they were moved back, and another company moved in to hold it, and Dad's company was, given some time to rest. Well, they were awakened in the middle of the night and rushed forward. And what had happened, the German civilians in this town had gotten the soldiers in this other company drunk. And then in the middle of the night, the Germans came back in, and the civilians were pointing out in the buildings where all the Americans were sleeping. And they came in, and they had tanks, and they point blank blew up those buildings. So they retook the town, and Dad said after the commanders learned what had happened, that town ceased to exist. They just wiped it out. And, there was another time and this really bothered him a lot. There were two companies that together were clearing a little village. And, let's see, I remember, okay. They had always been told not to use German weapons because there were two reasons for that. If you were captured and had a German weapon on you, then they might shoot you. If you were using the weapon in combat, they sounded different than American weapons. And Dad said what they would do is you'd go into a building, and if you'd hear a German weapon being fired from this room, that you're coming up to, he said, you just kick the door in, throw a grenade in, and then go in after it. And in this particular instance, some men of this other company were using German machine pistols. They were killed by their own men because somebody just threw a grenade in there. The captain who commanded this company was outraged by this, and they had some German prisoners. He ran them all into a building, locked the doors, and set it on fire. And Dad was always upset about that and said, that captain shouldn't have done it. It was murder. But nobody ever said anything about it. Now, he never would, one thing he never talked about, and I don't understand how it happened, if it was combat or an accident or whatever, but he was wounded the last day of the war. He did tell me it was a German machine pistol, and he was shot in the leg, I think he said 2 or 3 times. The thing that most upset him about it, though, while he was in the hospital, somebody stole all his souvenirs. But he never talked about it, so I don't know, what happened there.